Welcome to the Vault Archons. This is the Keeper of Keys, Kraz. And today we're just continuing to wrap some of these decks for the local schools. Well, not really the schools themselves, but the kids. So I hope everybody had a wonderful holiday. I'm assuming everybody did. Of course you know. No, they say about assumptions. Let's see, so let's go this way. So hopefully, I get the chips soon. I ordered the chips for this so that we actually will have some chips for all the kids to use. They're little plastic chips. They're, I think they said they're used for poker. I'm not 100% sure on what it was that they're used for, but they ended up being about 2 cents a chip, and so I was able to get a good number of them, for not too much. My other option was to paint a bunch of pennies, but since I found some chips that weren't super expensive, I was able to pick those up, which is nice. And all these decks have already been scanned, so it's nothing for scanning. Whoop. So been thinking a lot about Keyforge and what I think about it and all that. Just generally speaking, to see if my evaluation has generally stayed the same, because I like to pay attention to that kind of stuff. I think overall, I still think it's an incredibly good game. I think that it has a lot of potential. The real question is how many people is it going to attract? How big is the player base going to be? Those kind of things are really the key things. I'm waiting to see if some of the local game stores around me end up picking it up. So I'm still kind of waiting on that, and we'll see about that. I hope they do, because without local game stores, you're not going to make it very far for any game, really. I guess it could, do well on its own, but I just see the game stores as being a relatively important part of any, game, or at least some retailer, carrying it, other than online, because, a lot of these kids, how they get their things is by their parents, buying it off the store shelf when they're shopping or whatever else. So I think it'd be nice if it, enters some of these game shops or other things locally. But nothing to guarantee that. So I guess we will see how that goes. I think I've got enough now for just over 30 decks, I think is what we're sitting at. Somewhere around there. We've got something like that. So good number of decks. Should be able to have quite a few kids playing at the same time. I still need to go pick up keys. I don't have anything to represent the actual keys yet, so that's going to be, probably go down to the local hardware store and pick up, some blank keys of some kind and paint one side. Call it good, and that should be everything that is needed to play the game, since there's no cheap token packs available. I'm not going to go buy, 40 starter packs or whatever, whatever the craziness would be. I'm not going to go buy a ton of starter decks. Just way too much financially for me. I couldn't put down that much. That would be way outside of what I'm going to be able to do. So, but hopefully the local kids like this. Not a lot to do around here during this part of the year. The season's a pretty wet one. I'm sure most people have a relatively wet season right now. Well, I guess people in the tropics wouldn't. Well, I guess technically people in the South Pole, you guys are nice and toasty warm right now. while we're nice and wet and cold. So yeah. One of the things I did keep track of over the Christmas holidays was I was curious how many decks would be registered over the holidays, like how many decks would actually be registered, and so I kept track of the total number on the 24th of December. I took the number of registered decks on the Crucible, and the number of registered decks when I took it down was 370,569, and currently the number of decks is 401,150. So that's essentially an increase of just over 30,000, just barely over 30,000. So that's 30,000 additional Keyforge decks that were registered in 4 days. So that's probably the Christmas decks that were registered. So if you take, well, 1 second. I didn't do the math beforehand, but basically, and I'll do the math here in just a minute. If you take the total number of decks that were registered before Christmas and divide them by the number of days they had to sell, you can basically figure out how many decks were essentially being registered a day over the entire starting period. And then you can take the same for 4 days of the number of decks that were registered, so 30,000 over 4 days, and see if the number had increased, if there were more decks registered over Christmas than there were over the holidays. So let's see. Quick thing. So we had, I'm just going to round it to 371,000. Let's see. So that would have been the 24th. So how many days is that? November. So it came out on the 15th, so 15 plus 30, 37, 39, so there were 39 days. So divide that by 39 equals approximately 951 people registered, or 951 decks registered a day before Christmas. And after Christmas, 30,000 divided by 4. After the Christmas season, it was about 7,500 decks being registered a day. So the overall difference between the two is quite significant. Now, of course, the game has been increasing deck registration in time as time has went along. So that's not that increase isn't entirely that big of a difference. That's still a pretty sizable increase in the number of decks that are registered for Keyforge. That's 7,500 decks a day, where the norm up until now has only been 951. That's a sizable difference between the two. About a 8-fold difference approximately. So now, of course, I didn't take data beforehand, and I don't know who has that data, but data, of the preceding week would be interesting. So I think that's an interesting thing to know. So it does definitely look like sales for it are picking up. Another thing is I talked to a local game store the day after Christmas. And what he said to me was, he said that sales for Keyforge are picking up. So it definitely looks like more people are starting to pick up Keyforge. And again, like I said, fun game to play. I don't see a lot of people having a terrible experience when they play. Now, certain decks would definitely be a bad thing to get as your first deck. I do still think they have that problem. I don't know how long that problem will persist. Hopefully not too long. But overall, I do think that you're going to see that kind of stuff, you know, unfortunately. And as you can see, these aren't terrible decks. I mean, this one has a ton of card advantage. It's got a board clear. I mean, it's got some good cards. You know, it's not a bad deck. It's got a great amber control there. Another amber control. You know, these aren't terrible decks. Now these are going to get mixed in with the decks that aren't as good. So there's going to be a better variance in the decks that are in the pool. These are among the better decks. So there are still going to be, not the worst decks again, but there are still going to be some weaker decks in there. And so this has kind of been my solution for the decks I'm not going to use, is I can, you know, let other people at least get introduced to the game. And as long as I don't put in the worst decks, I don't have to worry about them getting a terrible experience. Also, none of these decks are super powered relative to each other, so none of these decks should make even the weaker decks feel completely outclassed. It's just going to be, it'll be a much harder battle for the weaker decks, but overall, I don't think it will be that big of a deal. So, I mean, and we'll see. Once this is all said and done and everybody's playing these decks and all the tokens arrive and I manage to make the keys, and still think early January is definitely when this will get finished. After that, I guess the other thing I'll talk about is collection. How do I feel about Keyforge as a collection? Do I feel it's a collectible game? And I have talked about this before. Do I still feel that way? I still feel like it's a very collectible game. I think that we're in its first print run. I think that there's going to be a considerable number of people who choose to start playing Keyforge during this print run. Oh, 1 second. I'll be right back. Okay, back. I do think that the number of players is just going to continue to grow. I think the game is fun enough and easy enough to pick up and has an easy enough entry point, even for those people who do pick it up and don't like it because they get a really bad deck or get a deck that isn't fun to play, or they play a deck that isn't fun to play. Even for those people that are lost because of that starting scenario, I think the majority of people will not have that scenario. And so you may lose some people to the initial experience, which is unfortunate. But I think the design kind of has that happen. I think if any of those people come back and try again, or get to play with decks that somebody has already sorted into more balanced categories, I think that, you know, they would be more likely to stay around and play it. I think some people, definitely the hardcore deck builders, if that's your thing, yeah, those people definitely aren't going to like Keyforge. Well, I shouldn't say that. They might like Keyforge if they play it, you know, in the way that that they're not trying to build the deck. I think if they go from that approach, there's a very good chance that they will really enjoy the game. I don't know, you know, whether that will be, you know, for people who just must or you know, absolutely feel the need to deck build. I don't think that a card game that doesn't have deck building will really be what they're looking for, and so I just don't see them enjoying Keyforge unless they just play it and don't worry about the deck building aspect. So another thing I was going to talk about. So in trading card games, you have things that are basically, everybody just calls them chase cards. You know, you're buying the packs to get specific cards. And that's what people do. They buy the packs and then they crack them hoping to get the $100 card or whatever else. So did Keyforge manage to eliminate chase cards, essentially? And I'm going to have to say no, not really. So what ended up happening, and this is just my opinion, like most of the other things I've said, you know, this is what I think is going on right now. I think there are essentially chase cards in Keyforge, and what the chase cards are is they're the decks. It depends on the person what a chase card is going to be. So it's a little bit more subjective, but not entirely. A powerful Maverick, I think, is a chase card. People are going to want a powerful Maverick just to have that powerful Maverick. You know, especially if it's, you know, say my favorite card is, you know, Mother. Right? If that's my favorite card, then a Maverick Mother would be a very interesting card to have. You know, now it wouldn't have to be in the best deck. Now it'd be cool if it wasn't a good deck, but it wouldn't have to be in the best deck. It would just still be, you know, if that was my favorite card, it'd still be a cool card to own. And that's why I say I think Mavericks are definitely going to be part of that. They're going to be kind of your chase-ish card deck-ish stuff. People are going to want to get that Maverick, want to get that specific, you know, maybe the Four Horsemen will be a chase thing. I don't know. I don't think so in the long run. I think has already kind of burned itself out. You don't see as many people, you know, going, oh, the Four Horsemen. And like I said, there are some dual Four Horsemen, you know, where it has two, you know, double Four Horsemen, and then other good cards. Some of those decks could be pretty decent, you know, but again, not any more powerful than the other rares, in my opinion. I mean, you've got, you know, other rares like Snecklifter. You've got other rares like Restring Guntus. You've got other rares like Dysania, you know, which can just be devastating against certain deck types. Just like the Four Horsemen can be devastating against certain deck types. So, I think, you know, it's like all the things in the meta. And I've talked about this before many times. A long time ago, you know, I brought this up very early on. You know, in the meta, you're just going to find a lot of different things that do work and sometimes things that don't work. And I'm still waiting to see what becomes the most popular tournament deck. You know, I know what a lot of people are, you know, glued onto right now, but I don't know if that's going to be the, you know, where the best decks are or not. I think people just, you know, people do want to know. They're, you know, everybody's guessing. I definitely think there are some very powerful decks out there that don't conform to what people think is a powerful deck. It's something different. And most people would never even recognize it as a powerful deck, at least at first glance. Those exist. There's plenty of those out there. You know, where people just go, oh, it doesn't have, insert the you know, 10 most common power cards, you know, and then because it doesn't have those and it has some weird rare combination that uses more uncommon and rare cards, it's much less frequent to show up, but nobody recognizes it because it's using a bunch of cards that you never see together. Like for example, I have one of those decks, which is the one that is mostly Sanctum and other stuff, and it has tons of board wipe and tons of amber control, but it's all in non-traditional places. And that deck, anybody facing it, you know, if they had Dis and Shadows and whatever else, they'd be like, oh yeah, I'm just going to stomp that deck. But the reality is that deck is really nasty, and it doesn't have any of your traditional power cards. It's got a whole different set of power cards that just happen to work well together. So, you know, again, you know, the most powerful deck is not necessarily going to be the deck that is the most commonly powerful. I think that's the word I'm thinking of. You know, there's going to be decks that are commonly powerful because they contain certain houses. Yes, that is definitely true. I think a lot of people have definitely talked about certain houses. Dis, Shadows. Dis and Shadows lead other decks to just be more powerful. So having those is just a more powerful, you know, potential. But then again, you have good generation for every house, and I would rather have a good generated Brobnar house than a bad generated Shadow house. I'd rather have a good generated Mars house than a bad generated Untamed house. You know, so it really depends on what generates, because a good version of any generation is much better than a bad version of a good, you know, one that usually is more powerful. because I've got plenty of decks that have shadows in it, which is one of my favorite houses. Plenty of decks that has shadows in it, and it's terrible generation. The board is weak. There's no good steel. The cards just aren't that good. And it's like, well, that's a terrible shadows house. And so there's plenty of those out there. You're just more likely to get a good shadows house than you are, say, a good Brobnar house. Getting a good Brobnar house is not all that common. You don't get those very often. But when you do get a good Brobnar house, those things can be really dangerous. You know, I've got one floating around somewhere, and I probably haven't even opened it yet. I've got one floating around that is basically, you know, an iron obelisk, a ton of guys, an earth shaker, a war drummer, you know, some bumpsies and other stuff. I think a bunch of smash also. And then on top of it, it's got other good cards and other good houses. And so it's like, that's an amazing Brobnar generation. You know, and so it really depends on the generation. You know, a lot of people are, you know, want to say that this house is best, and I think when you start talking about pulling average decks on the average, the most likely thing you're going to pull that's going to be really good, if you're just pulling decks, just randomly pulling decks, shadows and dis are by far the most likely to give you good pieces to make a deck better. Mars can also do that. So really, dis, shadows, and Mars, are those three combined will usually generate a pretty decent deck. Although Sanctum can be really good. Logos can be, actually Logos is great for cards. Like, there's just so many good houses, and they all seem to be decent. So that's just how I feel about it. You know, and I'm sure there's other people who disagree with me. But I'm going to finish boxing these, and I will talk to you guys again later.